Hi everybody, my name is Jeff Billimek. I work at Home Depot. I help out on our continuous deployment team. I also run our open source initiative and our on-prem platform strategy.
And my name is Chris Gruel. I work on the continuous deployment team over Spinnaker.
So just a little bit about Home Depot. I'm sure most of you here, at least if you're based in the United States, you're familiar with Home Depot. We got about 2,300 stores. We have a couple thousand engineers that do in-house development, and in fact, I think about 90% of our applications we write in-house. So even though it's like a hardware store or whatever, we do a whole lot of IT stuff, and it's really awesome. So a while back, we decided we wanted to look at Spinnaker, and part of the reason is we were trying to solve some different problems, which, because we're at Spinnaker Summit, most of you have heard this many, many times, but in the past and also in some cases right now, all of our different engineering teams, they all do CI/CD on their own. They spin up whatever CI tool makes sense for them. Some people use Jenkins, some people use Concourse or TeamCity, and they're trying to figure out all aspects of deployments on their own. And part of that is because we used to have a centralized thing and it didn't work that well. They couldn't install plugins, and so we gave people freedom to just use whatever they want. But the part of that problem is having all that flexibility is people want to have a standard way to do production deployments. And part of that is that doing CI with like a Jenkins or Concourse or whatever works really well. But we found that those tools are really great for CI, but they're not so great for doing continuous deployment. And we wanted to have a more consistent way and a safe way to do deployments.
Right, and each team had to follow all the enforcement, all the IT policies and controls and governance stuff, and they had to figure out their own way of implementing those controls in whatever CI/CD tool they chose. And anytime they needed to do more advanced things like blue-green and stuff like that, they had to figure out how to do it themselves in that way. And so we wanted to utilize something that can do that a lot better. So
yeah, like blue-green as an example, we found that people wanted to do blue-green, but like they had to create like some really creative hacky shell scripts to kind of simulate blue-green. And one thing Spinnaker does well, as we know, is that Spinnaker knows the state. And we didn't really have a really great way of maintaining state when doing blue-green type deployments using like a CI tool. And so Spinnaker really helps us with that. And so with all those things, we said, hey, let's take a look at Spinnaker. And so for several months, Chris and I have been pairing, and we learned Spinnaker, we experimented with Spinnaker, we found ways that it would work well for us and our company. And we also learned Terraform along the way, which is awesome. But going through all that, we came up with, we kind of started with, I guess, a philosophy that we didn't want to just spin up some VMs and deploy Spinnaker. We wanted to do something to be more repeatable in case we needed to switch regions or redeploy for whatever reason, or maybe even go to a different public cloud provider. And so we said, hey, we're going to start with Terraform, and we made sure all of the infrastructure that we're going to use would be using Terraform. And at Home Depot, we're a relatively large user of Google Cloud, and so that was like a natural fit for us to look at Google Cloud. And so we created this open source tool, which we call SpinGo, which we're going to do a live demo in a second. And we're using Kubernetes to deploy Spinnaker. We're using a lot of the Google managed services. So we're using cloud storage, Google OAuth, at least for the demo. Internally, we're actually using SAML provider, but same kind of thing. We're spinning up a VM to deploy Halyard, and we'll get into that in a little bit more, but it's an ephemeral VM, so we Terraform it up and Terraform destroy, and basically that gives us the ability to do whatever kind of configuration changes we need for Spinnaker, but we don't have to leave it long running. I think in the future we might look at doing like a config map deployment kind of thing or whatever, because we don't really like VMs that well. Memory store instead of the built-in Redis. So as you know, if you do like your basic install of Spinnaker, it comes with like one little Redis pod, and we didn't feel super great about that. And we know Google has memory store, so we're like, well, let's use that. At least it's multi-zone, and it's a managed service. Cloud DNS because we're running in Google. And then for the demo, we're using Let's Encrypt to get us a wildcard cert. And then container registry within Google, but you could really switch that out whatever you want. And then Cloud SQL because of the relatively new features for doing MySQL. And Cloud SQL is it's replicated. It's not multi-region right now, unfortunately, but we do backups, and it works pretty well. So what we're going to do is we're going to kick off a live demo, and while it's going, we're going to switch over to a recording of the demo. And part of that is because the amount of time that the Terraform takes to bring everything up, and then more importantly, the amount of time it takes for our Terraform like bootstrapping scripts to wire up and configure Halyard would take a long time. And so we've kind of shortened some of the parts in the video that we would normally do a live demo for. We'll still leave the live demo running, but we're going to kind of go back and forth a little bit. And actually, before we do the demo, I want to talk about part of what we're doing for Terraform, right? Actually, do you want to talk about what we do Terraform?
Yeah, so we have Terraform that's handling all the infrastructure, right? And it's wiring everything together where necessary. But what's also key here, and if you look at at SpinGo itself, you'll see it's almost half Bash and half Terraform because we're actually pre-populating a lot of the scripts that set up the Spinnaker infrastructure with the data from all of that Terraform building. And so what you end up with is when the Halyard box comes up and it starts up and it runs the scripts that we have, it will basically build out the entire Spinnaker deployment down to authorization and X509 and Spin CLI and the works.
Yeah, I mean that's probably the big thing is that not only does it get all the infrastructure and deploy Spinnaker, but it actually configures Spinnaker to use all of that and use it in a way that we think is for a decent scale.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to switch windows real quick. So right here, I'm in a Google Cloud Shell, and part of the reason why I'm using that is because the network here may not be that great. And I learned recently Cloud Shell is kind of cool because if you lose connectivity and you come back, it's kind of like being in tmux. It'll pick up where you left off, so you don't have to worry about doing your estate again. So I'm in a Google Cloud Shell. Last night we created a new Google Cloud project called SpinGo. There's nothing really in it right now. It's pretty much empty. And yeah, so first I'm going to clone the repo. And if we look at the README of the repo real quick, we can see that it basically has instructions on how to set everything up. It basically, for the most part, you run a script that asks you some questions about what's your project name, what's your region, what zone, what password do you want on your certificates, for example. And then you basically go into different directories and do Terraform apply. What we've done is we've wrapped all of those commands into one script called Quick Start for the demo here that'll basically do all those in sequence so we don't have to type it in front of you. So I'm going to go ahead and start it now. First thing it does is it validates what project you're in or what project you want to deploy to. So like I said, the new project called SpinGo, so I'm going to pick that. And then it's going to go through and turn on a bunch of Google Cloud APIs. And for those of you that have used Google Cloud before, you probably noticed this is going relatively fast. We kind of pre-warmed it and turned on all the APIs right before this, so we wouldn't sit here for 7 minutes while it enables all the APIs. And it creates a Terraform service account that Terraform's going to use. And the APIs we're enabling are all the necessary permissions for Terraform to provision all of the infrastructure that it needs. And now it's attaching the service account with the roles, makes the keys for them. And then also what we're doing here is we're using Vault actually to store Terraform state. So it's not like we have a state in the directory or whatever, we're putting it in Vault. You could put it wherever you want though. And now it's asking us for what password we want for the key store. We're just going to hit enter, and it's going to generate a password for us. We won't have to worry about what it is because it's all, like Chris was saying, it's all part of the Terraform outputs, and it's all wired together, which is kind of nice. And now for the DNS, we need to put in what domain we want to use. So in this case, we're going to do SpinGo .Spinnaker homedepot.com. And then it's going to ask us if we want to use a different project for DNS. In this case, we're going to use the same project. And then what region we want to use, we'll use Central. And then what zone. And this is to set up all the Google DNS stuff, and we'll use Central C. And then for part of Google OAuth, for those of you that used it before, you need to have a like an administrator email address to set up OAuth. So I'm going to put in one right now. And then it basically starts kicking off the Terraform. Yeah, and so it creates static IPs, it creates the DNS stuff, and then what we're going to do real quick, so we can run in the background, is we need to grab the NS records that it's creating in our project to put in our master DNS project. So I'm going to do that just real quick. Give me just a moment.
This DNS would basically be whatever domain that you own.
All right. So that part's done. It's now going through all of the Terraform. And so like we were saying earlier, oh yeah, we need to do OAuth setup too. Sorry. So OAuth, so we've scripted so much here. But unfortunately, Google doesn't allow or doesn't have APIs to do certain operations. That's why we're manually doing them here. A lot of the other things we've done, we've been able to completely script. We use expect to do lots of things. Yeah, we need to do the fiat service account credentials real quick. Sorry, just bear with me.
So what we're doing is we create a fiat service account that fiat is going to use, and we need to take that unique ID and grant it org level group read permissions, and which we've now done, and that's the last thing we have to configure.
Nice.
And we'll keep on going.
All right, so at this point, Terraform is going to spend a lot of time provisioning like the cluster, the node pools, and then it's going to provision the VM where Halyard's going to run. And then part of that Halyard VM is a whole bunch of scripts that we created where we think a lot of the magic sauce is that's going to wire up and configure Spinnaker to use the wildcard search, to use OAuth, to use Cloud SQL, all that. And that's going to all happen when Terraform creates the VM. It's part of like the init when the VM boots up. Yeah. So we're going to switch, while this is running in the background, we're going to switch to a video we made of the same thing and talk to basically what we're doing here.
One thing we should note is that by default, we're creating 2 clusters, 2 separate VPCs, 2 subnets, 2 everything. We're basically duplicating 2 separate Spinnaker foundations under the assumption like we've got a non-production one and like a sandbox one where we can just test out versions and things like that. And maybe when we do production, we'll still have our production Spinnaker, and maybe we'll have like a staging one that we can better test out versions in that particular project.
Yeah, we don't know how others do it, but like within like the same Google Cloud project, we actually spin up 2 Kubernetes clusters, like Chris was saying. In theory, those could be split to different projects, but we didn't see a lot of reason for that. We have a lot of debate. Where do we draw the line for projects, and that's where we landed. But yeah. So right now, we can see in the video, also what's happening real time is it's provisioning all the things. I'm going to speed it up just a little bit. Okay, so here, let me pause this real quick. So at the end of the Terraform step, when it provisions all the infrastructure and it provisions the VM, it gives us a gcloud command that we can use to basically SSH into the Halyard VM. There's still probably, in real time, there's still probably about 20 more minutes of activity that's going to happen on the VM as it downloads Halyard, installs. I think it installs Docker too, doesn't it? Yeah, it does a lot of, it installs a bunch of stuff initially, and then it does all the setup we were talking about. And so here on the screen from the video, you can see where Terraform basically was done, but all the work when the VM spins up for the first time is still happening. And we're going to basically tail the log of that initial setup that we're going to see right here. So we SSH into it, and then we run an alias we made called showlog, which is basically tailing like the install log of everything that gets created when the VM goes. And that's what it's doing right there. So you can see we're installing a bunch of dependencies we need that's needed like for all the scripts that's going to be running in the Halyard space.
Yeah. We're installing Halyard.
Yeah.
See, there it is. And then we start basically running our Let's Encrypt.
Yeah, to get the, it's using DNS to get the wildcard cert, and some people may want to bring their own certificates. When we run within Home Depot, right now at least we're using like our own wildcard cert, but for our open source SpinGo thing or whatever, we're using Let's Encrypt because it's more approachable for everybody. Right. But we're still, one thing I want to mention is that SpinGo repo that we're talking about here, that's what we're actually running within our data center. We opt not to use Google Auth, and we opt not to use Let's Encrypt for now at least. Yeah. So now the setup script is basically configuring Halyard to set up the different things, the bucket, all of those things. And some of these terms, I know Google only has like, I don't know, like maybe like 15% of the public cloud market share, and I know Amazon's much bigger, but because we're a retailer, we don't use Amazon. And so some of the terms I'm using may not, they may not translate well to Amazon, but they're all relatively similar managed services. Like Amazon has an equivalent of buckets, obviously it's the original S3, and then all their things. So when I talk about buckets and all that, it's the same analogy for all the public cloud providers. All right, and so here is part of the script we're tailing is it's basically setting up, I think it's setting up OAuth there, is that what it's doing?
Actually right there, what it was just doing is it was adding the gate local configuration to be able to log into the Cloud SQL instances, the usernames and passwords for the databases that were created by the Terraform infrastructure process, and basically adding those to the appropriate locations for Halyard to be able to utilize them.
Yeah, we use Cloud SQL Proxy, I think is a sidecar in the Cloud Driver and Orca microservices. All right, and it's basically doing the same operation for the two Spinnaker instances we're deploying. Like Chris was saying, we have one that we call Sandbox and one called NP. You can name those whatever you want through the Terraform configuration. By default, that's what we name them. So the activity that's doing is basically doing it 2 times 1 for each installation. And that might be what we see right here. Yeah. And then also Slack integration, it sets that up too. So basically before we kicked off the script, we had set some environment variables. One of them was our Slack API token URL thing. And so Terraform looks for that when it's running, and it wires up all the things that's necessary to set up Slack. So it's persisting that data, it's passing it into the Halyard VM, and then part of the initial Halyard bootstrap script is that it's wiring up the notification.
Yeah.
And then X509, we're using X509, actually, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so we've also automated the creation of the X509 certificate, the API gateway for X509, the creation of the Spin CLI, because part of what we want to do as well is have it so that when it starts it up and it creates the full setup infrastructure with authorization and everything, it also adds an application for onboarding, right? To alert when the onboarding bucket, the process that we're using right now, gets a file uploaded into it, so that the infrastructure sets up a notification on that bucket and PubSub, and we've got a PubSub listener that gets set up in Halyard to listen for that, and then we're setting up automatically a pipeline that will listen to that PubSub and alert Slack, And eventually, in the future, we'll have it actually process it and use dynamic accounts. But we're working on that.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that Chris kind of touched on is that once you get Spinnaker up and running, it's great, but if you want users to start using it, they need to have provider targets. And so also in the repo we have right now, and we're exploring different ways to go about doing this in an easier way for the users, but we have basically a shell script that they run that runs the appropriate G-Cloud commands that'll set up a service account for Spinnaker. It gets the credentials for that service account. Like Chris was saying, it drops them in a bucket, a write-only bucket, and then part of what we're deploying here is a pipeline that monitors that bucket, and then when someone wants to be onboarded, it'll basically notify us.
Right.
And then we have a corresponding script that we run, which will complete the onboarding as a Spinnaker operator to do the necessary how config commands. And then with dynamic accounts, it's going to be awesome because that'll make it so much easier to onboard people. Yeah, and part of the video here is we're pulling up, I think, that the end of all of the scripts that were being run. It's going to pull up the Spinnaker instance where we see that pipeline. And that's kind of a cool thing with the whole X509 Fiat thing, is that we're using the Spin CLI to onboard part of the bootstrap, onboard a Spinnaker admin type operator pipeline for onboarding people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we're pretty much done with that part of the demo, I think.
Just a little bit here.
Yeah, there's a little bit more.
X509 is about to get created.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's part of our bootstrapping script that's actually creating that application I was just telling you about for onboarding people.
We've automated the onboarding of the creation of the Fiat service account. And then here we see an onboard notification pipeline that's been created that uses the pub sub notification that is pre-configured, that's using the Spinnaker SpinGo admin Fiat service account and the Slack notification in here. And obviously we can take this a lot further, and that's what we plan to do in the future.
Yep. Yeah, let's actually see where we are with, yeah, so the live demo that I kicked off, we can see that the Terraform part completed. So I'm actually going to just see where we are with the Halyard VM creation real quick. And then we're going to go back to the slides. We have a couple more things to talk about. And there'll be time for questions if you have any.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's still doing more setup.
Okay, so
Okay.
just installed Halyard.
Yeah. Okay, real quick back here. All right, so kind of recap the overview of our approach that we kind of talked through and kind of showed is that we're using Terraform. We love Terraform. It's worked really well for us to provision all the infrastructure. And one of the nice things about the Terraform approach is that if we want to change the node pool that we're using for Kubernetes, or we want to, I don't know, change the static IP, or just basically change any aspect of what we're doing, we change our Terraform scripts and we Terraform apply. And we don't have to worry about well, how do we install Spinnaker to begin with? Especially that really helps when we have more people coming on our team that haven't really used it before.
Yeah. And then the glue that holds it together, is the scripting, right? As I talked about before, the ability for Terraform to populate those scripts with all of the infrastructure data.
And then, like I mentioned before, the onboarding part. So we want to make, part of what the area we work at Home Depot is we're like the engineering enablement area. And some of the lessons we learned from years ago when we had a central way of everyone deploying everything was that it wasn't necessarily really user-friendly, and it was you had to open a ticket, and you had to wait, and you had to talk to different groups. And we're really trying to make the process as self-service and as seamless as possible. And so we're exploring different ways to make onboarding even easier. One thing we're thinking about is that, when a new cloud project is provisioned, the service account is automatically created for them, and they don't have to worry about doing anything. All right, so some lessons learned as we went through this journey. So like we like Terraform. I think when we started, we had like everything kind of wrapped up into one giant module. And we quickly learned that when we wanted to make changes, that could be disruptive. So a great example would be we use CloudNet for our IPs, and because we're running in Google Cloud and the way we do firewall and all that stuff with our corporate policy and all that, we needed to keep the same static IPs because it was a big pain to change firewall rules when we changed IPs. So having the static IPs in its own separate module means that we didn't have to worry about them ever changing if we needed to change some other part with the way we're doing Terraform. Same thing like with DNS. So long story short is that the step I was doing earlier when you're setting the NS records, we don't want to mess with those once they're created because of getting changes made to our internal DNS was not easy.
Very. And then we looked at different ways to install Spinnaker itself, and whether we were going to we briefly looked at like through Helm charts, and we briefly looked at even just a manual install, but we went the approach of just utilizing Halyard in its entirety, but then scripting the inputs into Halyard, and I think it's worked out pretty well for us.
Yeah, I'm curious. Do any of you here use the Halyard Helm chart? Okay.
One in the back.
All right.
Two in the back.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was. It looked really compelling to begin with, and then we realized that if you want to make more changes or get kind of complicated with it, it was not great for us. And then the Redis thing, like I touched on earlier, when we deployed Spinnaker out of the box, there's one little lonely Redis pod, and we were like, I don't know if that's really great. We don't know if we want to be Redis administrators and like figuring out how to scale that properly. And because we were trying to embrace the managed services that we're paying for from Google, we were like, well, they've got this memory store thing. Let's use that. And that's been pretty good so far. And really, if you were in the 9 o'clock talk in here, they're talking about being less reliant on Redis, which we are, which I think we're going to talk about in a second. Actually, you are going to talk about right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So the talk he was talking about was from the team at Snapchat, and they talked about heavily about utilizing the managed service to handle scaling and all that, and that is exactly the reason why we have literally only our scheduler for both Orca and SQL exists still in memory store, but everything else is in Cloud SQL, and so that's all wired in. The scripts that run handle that for you. Yeah,
and we're trying to figure out like how multi-region we want to be with our Spinnaker installation. Like we have a limitation with Cloud SQL, it's single region, it's multi-zone. We're trying to figure out like, do we want to explore maybe running a different database technology that would allow multi-region? We still haven't figured that out, but it's something we're exploring. And then observability and metrics, we're using Stackdriver because that's all built in. We deploy via Terraform. The configuration for actually we're setting up Stackdriver, and we're setting up some basic alerting and monitoring for things like the Cloud SQL backups and other things like basic kind of health checks. It's one area we're going to dive into a whole lot more, but obviously if you're going to run Spinnaker for a large group of people, you need to have really good observability of what's happening in the system. And so that's all kind of wired up there. We're using Stackdriver, and then we have some other internal things we're probably going to use as well.
Yeah, and along with those lines with the Stackdrivers, we've got some policies, some Stackdriver alerting policies that we're setting up, because since Terraform is what set up the infrastructure, it knows those exact names of those exact items. So we have policies on memory store, and we have policies on cloud storage, and we have policies on gate being up in both clusters, and all that stuff just basically gets set up. It doesn't get set up right away at the start, but we've got a separate repo that you follow a little bit of instructions, and it just sets it all up for you because it can gather that Terraform data already.
Yeah.
Permissions. We had some interesting stuff with Fiat. It's good to know that others had some interesting times with Fiat as well.
Yeah.
But we had some stuff with SAML security, with Spring Security SAML to be specific. And how it interacted with our SAML provider, which almost certainly has been Home Depot-fied into having some difficult times with that.
Yeah, we had a problem where when we were using SAML, it would log you out after 10 minutes, regardless of what you're doing on the UI. So you could be in the middle of editing a pipeline, and then a modal would pop up saying you're logged out and you lost all your work. It was horrible.
Yeah.
But that's all better now. So our roadmap. So part of, like we touched on in the very beginning, is really one of the main reasons why we're looking at Spinnaker, or we're not looking at, the main reasons why we're embracing Spinnaker at Home Depot is that we want to have a very consistent, auditable, central way of doing our IT control checks. I know different companies do things different ways. There's like the SOX things, there's PCI, there's different kinds of things that you need to check for, and we have rules that we want to put in place to prevent people from deploying to production. So by using Spinnaker, we're able to kind of centralize those checks and enforce that they happen in all our production deployment pipelines. That's in our roadmap. That we're that's one of the big things we're achieving with Spinnaker.
Yeah, and the other things like secrets management of being able to have those those keys to the kingdom, not just in the how config, but like behind into Vault and pulled using dynamic configuration or some other type of tool. We're leaning towards dynamic configuration, but that's
Yeah. And then templated pipelines, there's a whole lot of power and I guess promise there, especially when we start talking about having hundreds or maybe even 1,000 or 2,000 people using Spinnaker. We want to embrace and use templated pipelines, and that's one thing we're really, really diving into. We're pretty excited about some of the options we have in that space.
Yeah. Cloud Foundry, we have a very, very large Cloud Foundry deployment foundation at Home Depot, thousands of apps, and we want to be able to tie into that. Now we haven't dug into that quite yet because our Spinnaker infrastructure is on Google Cloud, and we're getting the connectivity up the way we want it to be.
Yeah, and then we're talking about edge-based or edge target deployments, and so we're exploring containerization or Kubernetes in our stores. And so depending on where we go with that, Spinnaker seems like a logical fit to deploy to all of our clusters and stores.
Yeah. And we want it to be multi-cloud. We don't want to just tie it into just Google. We want the ability to deploy to Azure and other cloud providers. My long-term approach is to have SpinGo be something like what Halyard is for setting up Spinnaker, but for the infrastructure, right? So this is like the infrastructure setup that Spinnaker requires to run at scale, and then Halyard takes over from there, right? And so that's where we're going with this.
Yeah, and then I guess one other thing we didn't talk on earlier, but I wanted to bring up is the run jobs. Run jobs are really cool. You can do so much with run jobs. If you haven't looked into them, I highly recommend it. We've actually created some custom stages based on run jobs to do some of our IT control stuff. It's really, really cool. Okay, so we have finished demonstration. I'm going to see where we are just real quick on that, and then we'll go for questions if there's any. So we're still deploying something. I've got a bookmark here. Let's see if it came online, at least in our sandbox, just real quick.
So authentication is wired up. And if we go into the application, we're still, the last little bit that it's wiring up is Fiat and X509 and creating the pipelines using the X509 certificates.
Yeah. So who knows how much time it has left, but it's getting, oh, that's the video. Yeah, so, all right, back here. All right, so we have probably about 8 minutes or so. Any questions? Yeah.
So quick announcement before questions. Please go on the app and rate this presentation on the Spinnaker Summit app by Modev. And then if you have any questions, please put your hand up and I'll come around with a microphone.
You mentioned that you looked into using the Halyard Helm chart but chose not to pursue that. Can you give us any more detail on that?
Yeah, so what we found when we looked at it, at least the time we looked at it, if you're familiar with Helm charts, you set like these values for different things. And it looked like it did not seem like there was a lot of options to go really deep with different like settings. So for example, not only do we do how config commands to set up things like the how config file, we're overriding the profiles thing and the service settings. We're creating sidecars. We found it became very unwieldy, at least for us, to try to do all of that through a Helm chart. It didn't seem like a good pattern for us.
I'm curious how many SpinGo installations you think you'll have at Home Depot.
Ideally, I think we want to basically have, one.
For
right?
production,
For
yeah.
production, right?
Yeah.
And our production is going to do non-production, and production, it's just going to be the load. And then we'll have, one it's staging that's in that same environment, and then, one or two in non-production that we can be a lot more destructive with when necessary.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much everybody we've talked to, other companies, they all seem to echo the same statement, which is if you're running Spinnaker, try to run only one, and so for production. And so that's what we're striving for.
Yeah.
And then so that might beg the question, well, why do we have this repeatable process for deploying Spinnaker if we're only going to run one? Part of that is that we want to have a consistent way to do it and be all Terraform.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Can we see where it's at?
Oh, yeah, sure. One moment. And so if we refresh the application, no, it's still not there. Yeah, so
Okay.
we're still doing how deploy apply. It takes a long time sometimes.
In this case, we're actually doing how deploy apply wait for completion because we need everything up and running so that we can then create the fiat service account. And the thing about a lot of these scripts is, our quick start kicks them off, in the Halyard box automatically, but we're probably not. That's just for our demo purposes, right? It's probably going to be more, at least to begin with, something that you choose. Like if I choose to set up Slack, I choose to set up OAuth, I choose to set up these other things, and it would configure those if necessary. So it's more of a choose your own adventure.
Another question?
Yeah, it's more of a GCP-related configuration issue. Since
Sure.
You just said if you're going to run them, just only run one. Where does your Spinnaker instance live in which project that has permissions to all the other projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's one project, and the way we're handling permissions for all the other projects. So Spinnaker's running in its own project, and we may have hundreds of other projects we're deploying to. In those hundreds of other projects, a special service account is being created that has the appropriate permissions to deploy, like the GKE or App Engine or whatever. Those service account credentials get sent over to Spinnaker by way of a write-only bucket that Spinnaker will then ingest via how deploy or how config or whatever. So Spinnaker will have reference to all of those service accounts to do the deploys. And in the case of Kubernetes, of course, it needs to be a Kubernetes like service account or whatever. In part of our scripts that we have, it'll actually create a Kubernetes like kubeconfig file to have the appropriate access to deploy to Kubernetes.
Yeah.
But basically, one project, it does have all the creds for all the other projects, which is why we're very excited to leverage Vault and dynamic accounts, so we don't have those creds sitting in a bucket somewhere.
Which is what it currently does.
What's that?
That's what it currently does?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
It's in a bucket somewhere. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, I think there's one more question.
You mentioned that you have a bunch of teams using Jenkins, Concourse, TeamCity, and so on. You're introducing them to Spinnaker. How are they reacting?
So right now, it's kind of a painful process. Like it's the Wild West, especially dealing with cloud. Our current focus is mainly towards the cloud to help wrangle that Wild West. And so since they already have to deal with all of this stuff, our goal is to make it so easy that they want to use this instead.
Yeah, and then just to add on to that real quick. So teams have to jump through a lot of hoops to go to production, and it's kind of a painful process. And so what we're looking to achieve is by using Spinnaker and having those controls built in, it'll be a much easier process for them, and they will inherently choose to use Spinnaker for deployment. We do believe that they will continue to use Travis, Concourse, whatever, to do all their CI, and they'll use Spinnaker to just do the deployment, because we strongly believe Spinnaker is the best in breed for doing deployments and doing deployments well. All right.
So without going to too much specifics, do you think SpinGo could work in environments where we don't have org level read access, don't have cloud DNS access, and don't have wildcard certs? I can get it like a yes or like a simple yes or no, or so just curious.
I mean, it would do about 90% of it. Yeah, like even if you didn't have those and those didn't kick off the scripts, you'd still have pre-populated scripts with everything else, right? And starting very soon, we'll disable the auto quick start that does everything, and you choose which ones you want to run.
Yeah, the org level stuff would help for OAuth a little bit, and then to your point for DNS, at some point, if you want to have DNS for Spinnaker, you're going to have to make some modification to some DNS system somewhere where you can make reference to an NS record. Assuming you can solve that, I don't believe you need org level access to do it. Hopefully that answers that.
Really, the org level access is just because we're using Google OAuth, right? It needs to be able to read groups that are not necessarily in that project.
Yeah, like if you're using GitHub OAuth or whatever, that would not be an issue. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your attention.